wages, and they work in the factories, but they don't own them. So what happens, they say, what the capitalist does, let's say you own a textile factory, and you make shirts. And so you hire people in the town, you pay them as little as you can, pay them by the hour, and they make shirts for you. And then when you have the shirts, you take them out on the market, and you try to sell them for more than they cost to produce. And if you can do that, then that's your profit. But Marx thought, no, something is only worth exactly as much as it costs to produce. That's what it's worth. So if you got more than that, you actually exploited both the customer and the worker. It was the surplus value. Nevertheless, Marx and Engels said, what the capitalist does is he doesn't squander that profit. He reinvests it in his equipment so that the workers are now more productive. So as a result, he can fire some of the workers, pay the ones that are remaining less, and nevertheless, because they have better equipment, they'll be more productive, and so he'll make even more shirts for less money. Then he'll sell those shirts, more profit, which he again reinvests. And so over the course of several years, what happens is that his sort of equipment causes the workers to be more productive, and so all the wealth ends up being transferred from the hands of the workers to a few more or less semi-monopolist capitalist owners. And so here's what they said would happen in the Communist Manifesto. So here's the sort of pie chart. So this doesn't represent the numbers of people. Assume that the workers are 99% of the people, and assume that in 1800 in England, you know, the workers, the laborers in the red, have 55% of the wealth. That's sort of where they started, and the capitalists in the green start out with 20% of the wealth. Well, here's what they say happens in the Communist Manifesto over time. Very small percentage in the green end up with most of the wealth. And 99% of the population is the red. And so what happens at this point? Marx and Engels say what happens is that finally that level of exploitation, you end up with a revolution in which the people revolt against the capitalist exploiters, they liquidate the capitalists, they confiscate the means of production, and then the state owns the means of production and all private property on behalf of the population. And that's the socialist stage, and it looks like that. It's gray, all right? We know that. We know it's gray. Turns out, Marxist theory, this is a temporary stage. This wasn't communism. It's a temporary stage, and during the socialist stage, people cease to be tempted by private property. A new socialist man emerges, and then the state withers away, and there's a communist utopia in which everyone has enough to eat, enough to drink, and Marx has a great line where, you know, you're fishing in the morning and you're hunting in the afternoon and you're reading in the evening. It's wonderful. It's like the kingdom of God. But of course, all the communist experiments get stuck at the socialist stage. Now, what was the problem with this theory? There were a bunch of problems, but one was that this is not how the economy actually works. When Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto in 1848, 3 miles away there were factories where the wages of workers in those factories was going up rather than down. But Marx didn't do any empirical research. This is a purely theoretical idea. Well, this is the market reality, right? Market economies, there's lots of bumps and bruises. There's recessions and even depressions, but the market grows. Right now, I know this isn't that impressive of an animation here, but I had to learn this as an adult. I didn't get to be born into this technology. This is the best I can do. But you get the point, right? It grows, it gets bigger. That's important. Because what that means is that it's possible in a market economy for people to get fabulously wealthy, not by exploiting and taking wealth from others, but by creating wealth for themselves and for others. Now that's cool, but what's interesting is we know that economically. Economists know that certain kinds of economies, when they're trading with other economies and there's division of labor and all these things, get bigger over time. More wealth is produced, right? Both in total and per capita. But what the economists can't do as an economist is say how that's possible. And this is where I think theology actually answers a question posed by economics. Because the question is, I mean, how is this possible that wealth can be created? It's a weird sort of thing if you think of wealth as gold bullion, right, or land, or just a material thing. But remember, Genesis 1 says the Creator sovereignly calls the world into existence, right? And then he creates different creatures, and on the 6th day as an encore, he creates these beings in his image and likeness. And then he commands them and blesses them, doesn't he? He says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. We're the only creatures about which that command is made and that blessing, and about whom are described that we are created in his image. And so if God acts and exercises sovereignty and freedom and creativity, it stands to reason that we, in a diminished and derivative way, exercise the same kind of creative freedom. And so I think it stands to reason that that's a part of what it means to be made in the image of God. God creates the material world, and he leads it to us to create resources and to transform it. God creates sand. He leaves it to us to create fiber optic cables and computer chips, right? God didn't make those directly. He made the sand. Thomas Aquinas says, God grants to creatures the dignity of causality. And in fact, he grants to human creatures the dignity of creativity and a creation of wealth. And so what we want is an economic system that maximizes our capacity to serve our fellow human beings, to be able to serve our basic self-interest while serving our fellow human beings, and to create wealth and exercise our capacities as image bearers of God. Thank you very much.
Dr. Richards, would you have some time for questions?
Absolutely. I've got
just
plenty
about
of time.
maybe 5 or so minutes here, and then we'll get going.
You talked about that part about the pie or whatever, and like there's only like so much pie, and that's like
Right.
the zero-sum game.
Yeah, the pie, it's a little bit of an obscure distinction, but I distinguished in the zero-sum game, which had to do with the trade, assuming a winner and a loser.
Yeah.
The materialist myth is to think that there's a nature, that the nature of wealth is sort of material and it's fixed, and so it can only be transferred, like a pie. A pie is a physical manifestation of a zero-sum game.
Okay. My question is, do you think that has any root to like dystopian like teleology?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in fact, in the Money, Greed, and God, the last chapter is devoted to questions about environmental stewardship and are we going to run out of everything? And so very often, I mean, of course, there's not an infinite amount of oil, so I'm not saying that, right? There's just, you know, it's sort of magical. But the worry is always that, well, there's a finite amount of stuff. And so if we keep using it like we are, we will run out of it, right? It's several complicated issues to sort of disentangle here, but it's important to realize that what we're doing is we're looking at a resource as this thing out there in the ground. When in fact, in most cases, what a resource is the interaction of human creativity and some material substrate. Oil wasn't a resource for thousands of years. Nobody even really knew it existed, right? It was 10 feet under the ground on the Arabian Peninsula, and nobody cared, right? If anything, it bubbled up, and it was a burden to farmers, right? It was only at a certain moment in history, after we'd used certain kinds of resources. You know, you can read things in the 1600s in which people in the island of Britain were worried about running out of forests and wood. And the reason is because wood was the main source of fuel. And so it turns out that's what was happening. People were using wood, burning it for fuel, to stay warm, all these kinds of things. So the forests started getting depleted. And so you might say, well, if they kept doing that, they would run out. So why didn't they run out? Well, it's a basic law of economics. As something becomes more and more scarce, the price for that thing goes up. And so it became less and less economically viable to use wood for a source of fuel. And so what happened is people started looking for another source. And they discovered coal. They realized the energy in coal. And so guess what people worried about after that? They're going to run out of coal, right? And in fact, you could see this actually in the American founding. Thomas Jefferson was worried about this very thing. And so, but the reason we'll never run out of oil is not because there's an infinite amount of oil. It's because long before we'd ever actually run out of it, the price for it, getting it, would be too high. And so we will, you know, I believe, just based on historical precedents, we'll develop a different technology and develop a different resource. At the moment, the reason we're still using hydrocarbons for most uses is because it's overwhelmingly the most energy dense and least expensive source. But right now, if it was costing us $300 for every barrel of oil that we pulled out of the ground, we wouldn't be using it. But at the moment, most of the other sources are just uneconomical. And so but that's the kind of assumption. If you think of resources, it's this finite amount of stuff. You completely forget the role of human creativity in both anticipating needs, creating new technologies, creating new resources. Even water, most of the water we drink, right, actually pass through human activity. So it actually requires you to kind of think of resources as, it's not a purely immaterial thing, but it's an intersection of human creativity and a material substrate. And so that's why I don't worry about running out of resources in that sense, because I think that as long as human creativity is free to operate, when certain types of resources become uneconomical to use because they're so scarce, we will find others.